We're very, very lucky to have our first international guest speaker coming up right now, Paul Jordan, who works with the Energy Systems Catapult in the United Kingdom and has a 26-year career at this point, working in energy transition, decarbonisation, and commercialisation of new carbon neutral and renewable energy projects. And he's here to talk to us today about the experience in the United Kingdom. Welcome to the stage, Paul.
Thank you very much. Yes, such an honour to be here, and big thank you to ECA for inviting me. I've been here for just over a week now, and it's been an absolutely fabulous trip. Met a lot of stakeholders, and what's really come home to me is that there really is common challenges here. It's a bit of a cliche, but to achieve net zero, it's such a major task, and we can only really do that in collaboration. And one of the best ways in which we can accelerate the move to net zero is through that international cooperation and collaboration. So absolutely delighted, and I really do see huge opportunities for us to work together between the countries. It's hard to realise that it's 26 years in the energy sector, but what an amazing time to be in the sector. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit and give you a little bit of overview of what we've been doing at the Energy Systems Catapult. I'm pretty sure these slides will be shared. What I've tried to do in here is a lot of what we've done is publicly available. I've peppered this slide deck with all sorts of links, so hopefully when you get a copy of that, you can use that information as you see fit. And I'm hoping that some of this will be useful to you. There's kind of 5 broad areas that I'm going to sort of talk about. Firstly, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the catapults and what we do, but particularly how we approach this big challenge, particularly from a whole system point of view. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing in things like energy as a service, talk a little bit about some of the transport focus that we've been doing as well. Then a little bit about our Fair Futures work. We've already heard how important it is that this transition is equitable as best as we can. We need to make sure it's fit for all. And then maybe just lastly, if I've got time, talk a little bit about the work we do with from a consumer's insights point of view in terms of supporting innovators, because we're finding that the innovation support that we need to give really is critical, that the innovators really understand their customers and end users. So without further ado, I will hope this clicker's working. So so the Energy Systems Catapult is part of a catapult network. This was set up by the UK government about sort of 12, 13 years ago, really to try and promote innovation in a different way, recognising that the old way of sort of dishing out grants really wasn't resulting in innovation moving from that sort of development of prototype sort of stage into the market, into business as usual. And so the blocker really was the fact that there wasn't a real deep understanding of those barriers to commercialisation, and they can change from sector to sector. So they created these sort of innovation centres that were then renamed as catapults, but really at its heart is that there's this deep technical commercial capability. So in our case, we're 250 people now, but the bulk of the catapult is people with that deep expertise in the energy sector. So we can really delve into what are those systemic barriers that are stopping innovation. We're all not-for-profit organisations, but we are all independent. So we all sit in between industry, government, academia. So we can play that independence role, and that's really important as well. And we have our own boards, but we do get some core funding from government. It's about a third of our income comes from sort of a core grant from government, and that allows us to do things a little bit differently, take a bit more risk, focus on some of those assets that the sector needs that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily focus on. And a good example there, given that this is the consumer conference, is we have a fairly large consumer insights team, and we find that actually a lot of innovators wouldn't typically spend money on developing their own team in that sort of skill set. So that's just an example of where we can use some of that core money to focus on skills and gaps in the sector and help them unblock some of those issues. How we focus on this, so we have sort of 5 areas that so in terms of how we support. So we go literally from sort of national, big picture, understanding those net zero pathways in terms of the modelling capability we've got. We work a lot with local authorities, recognising that on this transition, you've really got to do this at a local level. So we do a lot of work in terms of regional planning, working with local authorities to help them develop their local energy strategies. We then get into sort of complex sites, particularly working with the public estate, but we're now moving more into industrial and commercial sort of sites, helping them understand how to promote energy efficiency, but again, trying to think a little bit more differently about how to do that with that whole system context. Then we get right down into the sort of residential level. One of the biggest challenges you'll hear me talk about is decarbonisation of the existing building stock in the UK. For us to achieve net zero, that's absolutely fundamental. So we do a lot of work in the homes. That also thinking about skills as well that are needed around that. And then by far, obviously, the best area is my area, which is the innovator support and international. So I get the cool job of working with a lot of startup businesses, but also coming on trips like this to talk about international collaborations. But part of that is also, as I say, about helping those innovators break into new markets, but also how can we tackle some of these problems together. So, hang on, sorry, there we go. So, as we said, I've had many years in the energy sector now, and I would say if you were starting your career now in the energy sector, what an exciting time to break into the sector. It is phenomenal in terms of what's happening. Lots of challenges, but my goodness, isn't it exciting? And part of that is this change that we've seen from this very centrally generated, sort of siloed kind of energy sector through to what now is a very complex, interlinked kind of sector, driven a lot by digitalization. We've historically on the supply side been looking at decarbonisation, decentralisation, etc. But that digitalisation is driving a whole new agenda. But the point I wanted to make on this slide really is the democratisation. That it's not just top down anymore. It's very much bottom up. We're seeing that people are so engaged in this sector now. I remember being in the pub 20 years ago talking to my mates about the energy sector, and within a few minutes their eyes would glaze over. It's like this is just not interesting. But now that conversation has completely changed. They're seeking me out, asking me questions. Should I put solar panels on? What EV should I do? How can I charge it? All these things have changed now, and that's really exciting and creates a whole host of new opportunities. So the other point, I guess, that's also I find really, really exciting in the sector is this slamming together of different sectors and the different mindsets from those different sectors. So I put three up here. The energy sector has been very traditional, very slow moving, very driven by regulation. But you're seeing these other two sectors that are very much involved in the energy sector now in terms of digital and automotive. They have very different mindsets, very different ways of engaging with the consumer. Digital, very, very fast moving. Often regulation is lagging behind how the market's moving. Automotive, you can see how the vehicles change on a very regular basis, responding to consumer needs. And a lot of that is changing the way the energy sector is now thinking about these challenges. And again, that's speeding up the pace of change in the energy sector because they have to. I mean, if you take the electrification of transport, for instance, the energy sectors can't just sit there waiting for the automotive sector to sort of just hope that the energy sector, the electricity sector is going to be there. They've got to keep pace with the demand from consumers and the move to these new electric vehicles, just as one example. So I think it's important for us to think about the combinations of those different mindsets and how that's playing, but also the learning that we can get from those different sectors around how to interact with consumers. So how does we, as the energy system catapult, how do we bring all that together? So we at the heart of what we do is this whole systems approach, and this slide tries to sort of illustrate that on one slide. So it's not just about those silos in terms of the energy vectors, whether that's power, heat, transport, etc. It's also about the legacy assets in terms of the infrastructure, but not just stopping at the network level, go right the way down into the home and right the way into the consumers, with the consumers really being at the heart of that transition. But also, we've got to think about the market structures. We've got to think about the regulations that support this. We've got to think about the business models and the value propositions that might need to come through, and ultimately, what policy changes are needed. There's also a need for this digital infrastructure that needs to underpin what we're doing. Digital and data is going to be absolutely critical, but how do we get that digital backbone? How do we manage the data flows and ownership of that data and things like that? So, but you can't really tackle this big issue by just picking off one or two of these points. You've really got to think about this in its entirety and take that holistic approach. Not easy, but that's kind of where what we've got to do, and that's certainly what we believe. So, I talked about that whole system kind of approach and how the consumer is critical to that center, to the center of that. Wanted to just talk about some of the ways in which we think, some ways in which we can kind of take that whole system approach, engaging with the consumers, things like energy as a service. And I want to sort of share some of the learning we've had, some of the trials that we've been running. The first point is thinking about service. So, again, I talked about the sort of traditional nature of the energy sector. You look at many other sectors that we interact with. They're already moving to service models. You buy the outcome that you want. You get you pay for the value that you perceive. If you go for a meal in a restaurant, for example, you don't buy a number of calories. It's usually an experience that you're buying. And we're seeing that many sectors are already moving this way. But energy, it's still kind of stuck in the past. I was reflecting on the fact that when I first as a student, I had to first sort of sort the utilities out myself in my student accommodation 30-odd years ago. It's exactly the same process today as I used 30 years ago. The bill, although it might have been now, I might be able to access it on the internet, but it's pretty much the same. It's still, kind of a bill that's hard to understand. The innovation just hasn't changed in terms of the sort of service model there. So maybe that's an opportunity for us in terms of moving forward in the energy sector. So what are the advantages of energy as a service? So if you can now change to new service providers providing this service, there's a lot of advantages to that. First of all, you move the point of system integration away from the consumer, because at the moment we're relying on the consumers to make those choices, make the integration of sources of supply and demand, etc. You can also start to unlock other consumer value. There's a bit of a fallacy there that consumers are just driven by cost. Some are, but not many. Actually, it's more about other aspects of the energy that people really value. So if you have a service that taps into that, can you price in a different value there, assuming you understand what consumers value? You can also unlock other revenue streams. So we think about flexibility, demand-side response. We know that a lot of networks are going to need to upgrade in order to deal with this future electrification. So there's a cost associated with that. Can you unlock that? Can you monetize that? And can you now use that and sort of integrate that into another service model so that actually the overall pricing becomes feasible? If you've got that point of integration through these service providers or aggregators or whoever it may be, it's an easier place to apply carbon policies, so you can get the outcomes that you want in terms of carbon reduction. Also, you can have better solutions for the fuel poor, the vulnerable customers, because again, you can target this in the right way. And lastly, you can start to see some potential to bundle these services together, which again allows for a sort of aggregation, economies of scale, etc., linking in some of the other critical things like social care, security, maybe other utilities, etc. So I wanted to sort of go through a bit of a case study in the UK, and I appreciate Australia is a lot warmer than the UK. But one of the biggest challenges for the UK, as I mentioned, is residential buildings particularly. you can see here the sort of challenges we've got in terms of moving not only our building stock in terms of the quality of the building stock, but also how do we move towards, in our modelling, a high level of electrification, so things like heat pumps, etc. So I just put some numbers on there, so you can see 330 terawatt hours per year is approximately the UK electricity consumption right now, and you can see if you sort of work out the maths there, I think it's about 220 or something is basically the change of electrification there. So that's quite a substantial move in terms of the infrastructure when you move from gas to electric. So there's all sorts of challenges that come around that. Now, talking about energy as a service, what about heat as a service? Is this a model that we could use to move people away from kilowatt hour bills to something that they actually want and value? So at the moment, as I say, people buy kilowatt hours. They buy sort of a boiler or a heating system. They pay for the maintenance. But what if it was that actually we move this towards people thinking about, actually, what I really want is I want a warm home. I want hot water when I want hot water. And basically everything's included. So you don't have to worry about where your heating and hot water comes from. You're just comfortable with the service that you get. Now, before I go on to how we did this, at this point I wanted to introduce some of the work that we do to try to get the data behind all this and be able to trial some of this, which is our living lab. So we set up a real-world demonstration environment. So this is real people in real homes where we can they're happy for us to trial different solutions, both technical and commercial. So this might be, for instance, we put in innovation around, for instance, a smart ventilation system in terms of the air bricks. We've tested digital platforms where the users might get an iPad so we can test the user interface and the apps, etc. But it's a facility that allows us to be able to trial real innovations, but also commercial propositions like things like heat as a service. It's now about 1,700 homes. It's cloud-based, so they're not sort of clustered. Some properties are clustered historically, but it's designed that it can be virtual. It goes up into a cloud-based digital integration platform, allows us to get all those data points, and allows us to then, as say, different opportunities come along, we can trial those in the living lab. And it also includes an opportunity for us to trial different policy questions as well. So this isn't just about sort of innovation, but we also work a lot with government stakeholders, the regulators, etc., who might have key questions that they want to have answered. And again, this is a facility to be able to do that. So I just wanted to flag that up because that's critical, really, for us to be able to do a lot of these tests and trials that we've been progressing. So with the living lab, data is absolutely fundamental to all this. In order to understand the consumer, you really need to gather the data so you can do the analytics to work out how do people really use energy, what do they really value. And this is just one example of the work that we've done around heating. And you can see that the range of different types of consumers there in terms of how they just deal with temperature control, how they heat different rooms up. I'm sure you can probably everybody in the room is probably starting to look at this going, am I a cool conserver? Am I a toasty cruiser? What am I? But the point is, we're all different, right? We all operate in different ways. And therefore, if you're going to start to move to a service proposition, you need to understand this. So what do we do once we've kind of got that? Well, we then start to get into what could a heat plan look like? So our concept here was warm hours, basically. So there are 24 hours in the day, so there's 24 potential warm hours. This was based on a sort of weekly plan here. And the idea was to sort of move to something that people could relate to in terms of things like miles per gallon. If you're comparing a vehicle, we often do that. What do you get in terms of miles per gallon from your car? Oh, mine's 40. Oh, yeah, I only get 35. You could have a similar sort of conversation around warm hours. How many warm hours are you paying for? I'm doing 45 a week. Okay, that's interesting because we're doing 65. I wonder why that's different. So it changes to something that is much more relatable, and you can start to then see how do you price that in. So we found that more than half wanted to buy the heat plan after we had a few dropouts. Because the eagle eyes of you will realise there's only 47 there, which is less than half of 100. But it was after the dropout there was more than half bought the heat plan. and it was also interesting that flexi-time was the most popular, but as I say, you look at the way people then behaved even when they bought the plan. So if you look at the sort of all-you-can-eat buffet version in terms of the unlimited, people sort of bought that, but then they never actually increased their energy use, so they didn't actually need it. But they thought, actually, I want that peace of mind that I can just use, have those warm hours whenever I want, as opposed to the fixed time where yes, people might use more of those extra hours, but again, it wasn't as much as you would have thought. Now, I appreciate this is only a small trial, but it starts to give us a feel for where things are possible. The interesting bit with this as well is that we also did a little bit of a test with those people also to say, well, does this genuinely enable us to move to low-carbon solutions? And the answer was categorically yes. So people on a heat plan were much more inclined to adopt a low-carbon solution compared to not. So you can see the difference between those with just a heat pump alone who were offered a heat pump. This was for free, by the way. They were offered a free heat pump, but they were less inclined to do that than if they were on a heat plan. And part of this is about building that trust in order to then feel that, yes, I like this heat plant, I'm getting the service that I want, I don't necessarily care where it's coming from. So if you're telling me that actually I can now have a low carbon solution as well, great, I trust you, and as long as the service is the same, I'm very happy. So this gave us a strong feeling that actually a service model, could be a really good way to unblock a lot of what we need to do in terms of low carbon solutions. And I'm hoping now we can play a video and you can hear from some real consumers.
There is some unfairness to how people pay their bills at the moment. People don't actually understand their bills and don't understand how much a kilowatt is.
I don't think anybody understands kilowatts and all things like that. They're saying, how many kilowatts have you used? You think, I didn't get a clue.
I think it's quite old-fashioned, and I don't think it's very user-friendly to have kilowatt hours because it's very hard to the consumer to understand, and when you go to change provider, they sort of guesstimate what you're using, and if you get it wrong, then your bill can massively change to what you've been told it was going to be. So I think it does need to change.
My relationship with energy has changed. I used to just pay the bills. I used to moan if they were too high, or tell the children to put the radiator down, or turn this off or turn that off. I've now become more conscious of the fact that I could put the heating on for a little bit extra and it's not going to cost me the earth. It showed me how I could actually economise without being uncomfortable.
There's quite a lot I've learned, and I'm a bit more savvy now with the way I heat the home and the cost and the efficiency for the family, so it's been really enjoyable.
I've learned from the trial that I actually use quite a lot of energy, and also that my home doesn't take very long to heat up at all.
It's opened our eyes. We were very ignorant to the cost of heating. I think this has massively put us in control of something that before we just paid a monthly bill and accepted it was what it was, but now we can alter it because we can control each room temperature.
The best thing about the new way of buying heating is that it's tailor-made. People really listening to what you want is an individual rather than as a mass, so it's definitely individual heating and you feel valued in that sense. It advised me that I could actually lower the amount of hours, lower the temperature, but I could get the comfort that I wanted from that quick burst of heat.
You can get a better rate because you're buying in advance, so you're getting a nicer cost constant now.
I think the idea of buying a warm home as opposed to buying kilowatts is a much better way forward. You're actually paying for the heating that you actually want, because although I want to cut down my bill costs, obviously, I really don't want to be sitting there with 3 jumpers on. So the idea by economising on the temperature but having it on for longer so that it wasn't a big boost, that seemed to be a really good idea.
It recommended that I could reduce the temperature gap that I have. Things like that. If I sat down and did it, I think I could save a lot of money.
Buying a tailored package to my home, I think it's a real positive way forward. You can control it more, as in what suits your home, not just what suits the nation.
Now I can work out how many hours a day I could use and when I need it, and when it benefits us really. It's a great concept. That's the way forward, definitely.
Always good to hear from others. No, it's really an interesting trial, and as I say, we're continuing to pursue this and see how far we can take this. But we do generally think this could be an interesting way to unlock some of the challenges here. Conscious that Australia, as I say, doesn't necessarily have the same sort of heating challenges as UK, but maybe there's a model there could be used around cooling as a service. I don't know, but it could be worth exploring. But I recognise we have got very similar challenges on transport. So I just wanted to say a little bit about transport, some of the work we're doing. You may or may not be aware that the UK has this is sort of policy driven in some respects. We have the ban on internal combustion engines from 2030 with the phase out of plug-in hybrids to 2035, so that it would be sort of full electric from there on. So you can see the change then in terms of the move again to sort of electrification there as you move towards battery EVs. Lots of opportunities come with that around things like smart charging and vehicle to grid, in terms of, is that a way in which you can start to bring forward some opportunities in flexibility from that. But, you've then got other challenges around the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, particularly public charging, etc. And this also includes, obviously, views on other transport solutions, which way heavy duty is going to go, shipping, rail, etc., etc. A lot of that's in the report if you're interested in some of those other spaces. But I'm not going to go through these next couple of slides in detail in the interest of time, but there will be in the pack, and as I say, feel free to get a copy. Point here is, again, is just the whole system approach, again, is absolutely critical to transport. You've got to, again, think about how the consumer is going to, what is their user profiles in terms of charging? What is their behaviour? How do you have a system that deals with the fact that lots of people live in lots of different types of accommodation? Whether do they have off-street parking? Are they in high-rise, etc., etc. You've also got to think about the implications of the policy and regulations that's applying around that. What are the right price points, etc., etc. There's lots of different ways, lots of plausible solutions here as well when it comes to transport. This is trying to sort of show that broad range, but basically what it's saying is there's sort of traditional ways of looking at this. So you can be sort of industry or centrally led. So you actually just build the assets. It's kind of the build it and they will come sort of approach. Or you can look at this more in terms of, again, a sort of a service model. So it's much more consumer led and driven by the consumer behaviour. Personally, we think it will be the consumers, again, that will ultimately decide this, as we've seen in many other sectors as these things have rolled out. But many of these permutations are plausible, and obviously our job is to try and navigate to the right one. So we did do some trials looking around this. There was a couple of trials we did. The CVEI, the Consumer Vehicle and Energy Integration trial, looked at charging behaviour, but also vehicle uptake. I'm not going to talk about the vehicle uptake one. Again, follow the links and you'll see some of the studies. That was basically sort of looking into things like range anxiety. I think off the top of my head, it was sort of 50% uptake if you could get sort of 100 miles. That increased to about 90% uptake if you got to sort of 300 miles in terms of the range. So it sort of starts to look at some of those sorts of aspects. But I thought you might find it interesting on the charging behaviour trial, because I know there's a lot of discussions around demand-side response and flexibility. So this trial looked at effectively the VW Golf in terms of the internal combustion engine, plug-in hybrid, and the battery version. And we had these three different charging regimes. So kind of kind of a flat rate tariff, so there was kind of no managed charging. There was a user managed charging, which was kind of a time of use, so that the user could move it themselves to try and avoid those peak times. But then we also had a supplier managed charging. So this was kind of an artificial supplier that we'd created that was effectively doing the moving for you with a much more sort of dynamic sort of pricing structure, if you like, in terms of how they could move it to the best point for them and the system. What we found is that by far the users liked the charging regimes, and actually they preferred the supplier managed charging option more than doing it themselves, which was kind of an interesting outcome. And you could see from some of the slide there in terms of the energy profile that you can see that it was having effect in terms of shifting away from that peak demand. So it can kind of work and have that impact. But I put a couple of caveats there, which is that you need, there's a lot of communication that's needed around this. You know, allowing the consumers to really understand what this means and what we're talking about there is critical. But also you've got to make sure that the market arrangements are already there. You may or may not have seen recently the National Grid is pushing forward with some of their flexibility sort of trials, sort of for real, and there has been some interesting outcomes. Certainly in our living lab, we've seen some of the people that are in the living lab have significant changes in behaviour in terms of when they're using energy based on those hourly times that National Grid are sort of seeking flexibility. And maybe that's again an opportunity for vehicle to grid as that could grow. We also looked at the sort of charging infrastructure itself. How would people respond to different ways of charging, given that there was this approximately 30% of UK households don't have off-street parking. I understand from chats I've had over the last week with many stakeholders here that there's a lot more kind of detached properties and maybe a lot more off-street parking in Australia, but nonetheless there will be a lot that still need that solution. So we looked at these three kind of charging options. One was on-street charging, which is a bit more like sort of that wireless charging kind of concept. A sort of local hub, so something that was only a few minutes walk away from your house, where you could park overnight. It was a secure location, so maybe there was 24/7 sort of guards, etc. And you could leave your car sort of trickle charging overnight. And then the last was then a concept that's very similar to kind of what we do now. It's kind of a sort of petrol station type concept that you go somewhere, you drive to that sort of rapid charging hub. It might be a 10-minute drive away, but you can get that rapid charge into your vehicle. I should have added as well that this was on the back of what was set up around this EV Energy Task Force. So we were asked to sort of lead this task force for government, and this was bringing, as I say, my earlier slide about those two different cultures in terms of the automotive and energy sector kind of coming together. And this was a really great initiative because this was the first time those two sectors were kind of talking to each other around the challenges of getting this right. So there's some really great recommendations that were coming out of that work. One example was things like smart charging being kind of an opt-out rather than an opt-in. So charging points would have smart charging by default. And so looking at some of the sort of standardization of how we can do this was making, you could make a real difference in the future. In terms of the sort of, just move on. So what was interesting was the difference between those users that had EVs already and those that were thinking about it. You found that those with EVs absolutely preferred the local solutions, whereas those that didn't have EVs were then more in the old traditional way of thinking in terms of needing those rapid charging points. But again, a lot more needs to be done on this, but it was interesting to see how the consumer sort of desire was changing. How am I doing for time? Let me have a look. Okay, we're all right. So I'm just going to rapidly go through the next few. So Fair Futures. So we have our own Fair Futures programme, and we've heard a lot about this already in terms of the sort of introductory comments. we need a system that's fair for all. If you look at some of the challenges around the fact that, you know, do people use the internet? Do people can people afford some of these solutions? You know, we find that in the UK that 34% of UK adults have less than £1,000 savings. So, you know, can they afford to buy some of this infrastructure that might be needed? People have challenges around switching. People have mentioned around understanding their energy bill. So we need to have that vision where this system is fit for all. But also, I think there's other ways in which we can look at wider challenges. So I wanted to just play you a bit of a video around some work we're doing on warmth on prescription, which is again thinking about energy, but in a different way that can start to tackle costs in other parts of society, particularly in our case, the National Health Service, because there's a lot of people that end up going into hospital with because they've got chronic illnesses because they can't heat their home or afford to heat their home, and actually that's costing more than what it would cost if you actually sort of paid for that heating. So we've been trialling this warmth on prescription kind of model, and it's now taking off and really, again, could have real potential impact, but a real win-win in terms of saving money for all, really, and giving everybody a better outcome in terms of society. So if you could quickly play, that would be great, please.
Many people can't afford the heating they need at home. And if you've got a health condition, like cardiovascular or respiratory condition, being in a cold home can make that much worse.
Currently, the NHS is spending over £1 billion a year on treating people with illnesses related to cold homes.
We thought, what about if the health service just could prescribe people a warm home? Maybe prevention would be better than the cure. We realised that if the health service could buy the energy that patients needed but couldn't afford, then they would be able to get the warmth they needed and stay out of hospital. That would probably save the health service money overall, keep people well, and actually make sure that the energy that's needed gets paid for.
Because when you sit down with a patient, sometimes they don't know what's wrong initially. They might come to you because they're feeling a bit low or depressed. And when they're telling you that they can't afford to pay their bills or that, you know, they're in fuel poverty, it's nice to know actually there is help for them there.
Well, I suffer from extreme emphysema and I'm prone to chest infections.
For me, I had to choose between food and heating, and obviously heating had to come first to make sure that Andrew was warm, because obviously with him having emphysema and COPD, if he gets pneumonia, it means that he can become seriously ill and end up in hospital.
The cold home don't help at all, not when you've got respiratory problems.
We all know how pressured the health service is at the moment. What this project's allowing us to do is actually to be much more proactive, because it's much better to stop someone getting unwell and keep them well. You don't have to wait for trouble, you don't have to wait for the cold weather. You could get ahead and go, right, this is the group of people we're going to target this winter. And then they don't have to experience the cold in the middle of winter because all of these things are in place.
Have a referral form, which isn't very long, fill it in, and within a day or two they're in contact with the patient, which is the fastest response we're getting from services at the moment, so it's remarkable.
It was worked really well alongside what we usually do as an organisation. We do provide quite a wide range of support, so we can provide funding for physical things such as insulation and heating. So it's worked really seamlessly.
The support services, whether it's 7Y or the Catapult, they've just been so responsive and supportive and just made everything flow so quickly.
A huge amount of enthusiasm. I think the main question we're getting from people is, can we do more of it? Because obviously it's a pilot. We wanted to test it first of all. We're getting very positive feedback. When we tell people about it, more senior managers are looking at, right, where do we go next with this? For autumn and winter next year, we want a much greater offer. And then that offer will also help us to identify people and provide them with additional support to help them through the colder months of the year.
It's helped all sorts of people in different ways. And so to be able to help people and make such a difference it's really, really nice that we can do it with this pilot scheme.
I can't believe how much it's changed us. Andrew's healthy, and it's been the first winter in a very long time that my husband's been able to be warm, and that's a huge thing for us.
Oh, amazing. It's never been off. I haven't had to find the money to put on the gas to put the heating on, because you supplied it for me. Yeah, it's just been brilliant.
Now we've confirmed the service works on the ground, we're hoping to scale up in the Gloucester region next winter so more people can benefit from the service. There's no reason why other parts of the NHS can't try it out too.
And we can't thank you enough.
Thank you. I think that just brings it home to us how important, you know, the energy sector is, but also how, as I say, we can start to think about this more broadly and think about those wider societal costs and how we can create some of these win-win sort of solutions. So lots more we're doing in the sort of Fair Future programme. Again, not going to go through all those, but just put them in there. So as I say, feel free to click on those and have a look at the wider things that we're doing. But it is a big area for us, and you know, having some significant impact. So again, if any of that is of use to you, that's fantastic. So finally, quick word about startup innovators. So the area that I run is an incubator accelerator called Energy Launchpad. So that brings together our capabilities with things like system integration, digital data, consumer insights, etc., alongside other partners to work closely with our incubation managers. So it's a very hands-on approach to work hand in glove with those innovators to really understand their acceleration and commercialization needs. We've now been working for coming up to 5 years, supported over 300 startup businesses. A lot of those have been raising significant investment. So we start with that whole system approach and we take it through to trying to support scale up. But the point I just wanted to just touch on here was that we find that with pretty much every SME startup business that we work with, the business model innovation is critical. Because a lot of times these startups they're not able to navigate what that future energy system is going to look like, and particularly how their business model should evolve. And when we start to get into that business model innovation, very quickly you tap into, well, do you really understand your customer base? And do you really understand how your customer is changing? And do you really understand what they value and what they can actually price in terms of that value proposition? So when you look at things like the business model canvas here, or elements of the business model canvas, you can see that value proposition and customer profile are two fundamental parts of that. And essentially that boils down to what are the consumer benefits, but also what are the consumer needs and how do those two relate? So again, I just highlight that because this is really something that we need to do much more of in the energy sector if we're going to see the right innovation come through and really help them scale. And just to give finish with a sort of couple of examples here. So Zero is an organisation that's looking at sort of net zero homes. They have a proposition around comfort as a service as a way of promoting that. And so we've helped them to really test home buyers' attitudes to that sort of model through our consumer insights team. They've gone on to raise 5.5 million recently with Legal & General and Hodge. Likewise, a company called Equiwatt. It's a much earlier stage company, but they're looking really at the virtual power plant type innovation, thinking about flexibility, working with people in the home and sort of encouraging them to turn things off, and they get sort of credits for turning off appliances and what have you during periods that they sort of set in terms of they send out a sort of alert and said, you know, this is a flexibility sort of period. And again, we're working with them to help them make sure that as they do that engagement with the consumer, have they got the right app? Is the user interface appropriate, et cetera, et cetera? And again, they've raised 300k in the last couple of years and are continuing to grow and seeking more investment. So just a couple of examples there where helping those innovators really understand the consumer behaviour and consumer value is really helped them accelerate in terms of their commercialisation, and something we would strongly advocate. And there's a really nice testimonial there from Johnson Fernandez, the CEO of Equiwatt, and highlighting that they don't really see a lot of that sort of support out there for that type of activity. So just to wrap up, in summary, just wanted to leave you with these thoughts. First of all, coming back to that whole system approach, you know, we see that whole system way forward is absolutely critical with the consumer at the heart of it. Energy as a service, we think, is a viable way to unlock the adoption of low carbon solutions. And the work we've been doing with Heat as a Service and also the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force has kind of given us some confidence of that. Data is absolutely critical. So we would really advocate creating that real world demonstration environment like the Living Lab. Perhaps that's something that, you know, maybe Australia could benefit from, or maybe you have one already somewhere. But, you know, again, that's something maybe we could work together on between the countries. Lastly, also that fair future for all is really important. But as I said, there's a wider context there, and thinking about how this could roll out into other areas like health, social care, etc. And is the more that we can do for the benefit of all. And lastly, consumer insights is absolutely critical for helping, you know, these startup businesses and innovators coming through in this space. You know, helping them navigate that future energy system and making sure that they're thinking about the right business models and value propositions is absolutely key. So, just want to big thank you, and really appreciate you being the custodians of the Ashes just recently. But I'm glad you're bringing them back home to England this summer. So thank you very much.
You were doing so well.
Yeah.
Until the end.
Trying to escape.
Yeah. Tell you what, I've never felt so seen as with all those people in that video talking about how no one understands kilowatt hours. I am your civilian layperson for this. We're going to do a quick Q&A. We've got 10 minutes before morning tea, and there is one thing that I am good at in this life is making sure we get to morning tea. All right? So I just want to quickly ask you, we've got a lot of feedback from the audience, but one question in particular that's been upvoted was, how does heat as a service actually take into account the differences in the energy efficiency of homes? You know, if one has insulation versus one that doesn't, how do you separate that in the billing?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to say is that again, this needs to be. It goes back to this whole systems approach, and if you're looking at this from a heat area specifically, then you've got to also think about the whole house retrofit. The slide I had from our Innovating to Net Zero report showed some of the innovation priorities. You know, the top one there was whole house retrofit. So that is key. You know, you still need to be thinking about how do we improve the building stock. You know, heat as a service isn't going to be a sticking plaster there that's just going to avoid us having to do that. But at the same time, obviously, the numbers will show up those inefficiencies. Going back to my point around the example of where you start to compare sort of miles per gallon. So if you're comparing warm hours, you know, if you are down the pub chatting to your mates and sort of talking about number of warm hours and the cost that you're paying, you know, if your friend is much lower than you might then start to question, well, why is that? And it might then be obviously because of the energy efficiency in your property, and then you can start to make a choice around, well, what's the investment that I can make in terms of insulation or whatever that can then give me a return, and it's much more easier to work out that, you know, that return on investment for making that change in your building, you know, efficiency, if you like.
Why don't you come in the middle, just because I don't want to block your way. I know it's a bit awkward while I'm standing in your over there. Sandra asked, you know, you said that market arrangements need to evolve to clear routes to market and improve market signals. Can you expand on what that means in practice? What does that look like?
So yeah, it's not massively clear yet around how the flexibility markets are going to be sort of monetized, if you like. There's some sort of trials on that, but there's a lot more that needs to be done, particularly at the sort of local and sort of household level, if you like. So how will we? So in the UK, just one example would be we have distribution network operators. So those are very sort of passive organisations. You know, they move energy from one point to another, but they don't yet sort of balance the local system. So if you move more to a system operator where there's now a way in which somebody has the sort of responsibility for balancing that local system, making sure you've got the right capacity in the network, making sure that you've got the right power quality in terms of, you know, maybe there's voltage drops and other things in terms of parts of your system, then you can pay for that, and that will then create more market opportunities for those sort of ancillary services, which can then allow for kind of third parties to come in and sort of offer the services, against that. So you could start to aggregate right now flexibility in the home, but where is the trading opportunity to release that into a revenue stream from the sort of system operation? So you're seeing that at the transmission side right now, but it needs to get more down into the distribution side as well.
We're doing okay for time, actually. This one might get lost because it came up last, but the prescription, warmth as a prescription, a warm home, was such a great idea. And somebody asked, how we might get a similar service in Australia. Was it a case of just giving money to the NHS or getting them to use it from within their own budgets? Or?
Yeah, so ultimately the money did sort of come through the NHS. One thing that is worth clarifying is that it's not the GPs that are prescribing it, because one of the other pushbacks we got with this programme, there was a whole Twitter storm on this in the UK, because everybody was like, well, GPs are massively overworked, they can't have more of this, but it's actually...
Our government hates it when GPs prescribe things as well. It costs too much money, so they try to stop them doing it.
But it's sort of the intermediaries, the service, there's sort of the health service providers, the community service providers in between that were offering the service, and they can prescribe certain measures. So for a long time there's been service measures that can be provided for things like trying to help obesity. So you can prescribe, bicycles and these sorts of things. So it's kind of a follow-on to that. So the money just kind of flow through the health system, but it comes through those community health service providers and also avoids the pressure on the GPs.
And last question, this is the most upvoted question that we've got, but how does Catapult actually consider people who have no choice or control in terms of accessing energy performance and other measures, particularly people on low incomes and renters? I was a renter until about 2 months ago. I'm 35. So it's a really important question to me, but how do you actually differentiate?
Yeah, so the first is that we want to try and move away from kind of a broad brush kind of approach to categorizing people. So what I mean by that is fuel poverty, as definition in the UK, is if it's more than 10% of your annual income. So of course at the moment, like about 75% of the population is in fuel poverty with the high energy prices. So those sorts of blanket kind of ways in which you categorize those segments of society is not particularly helpful. So because there's lots of different people in that bracket for lots of different reasons. You could have a very wealthy couple that are living in a very, very energy efficient property that have very, very high energy costs, but actually they can afford it because they're, so they would still be in that category. So what we're trying to do is to say, first of all, let's really understand the different segments in that block, so that you can understand what their situation is, how they use energy, what they really value, etc., etc. And then you can work with the sort of policy providers so that they can tailor the approaches in the right way to the different segments more appropriately. And that, we believe that would actually save a lot of money, because you can target the right interventions to the right people with much more efficacy than if you tried to do it on this blanket approach. So that's kind of the goal, if you like. That's where we'd like to get to, and a lot of the work we're doing through the Fair Futures programme is trying to gather that evidence, gather that data, start to understand how we can do different things for different types of segments of the sort of vulnerable customers, fuel poor, etc. So
that's a great answer. It's all about choice, really. I make the distinction in my own writing about the difference between being broke and being poor. I was poor as a kid and I was broke in my 20s because I wasn't particularly smart.
Yeah, good example.
Thank you so much for that. That was a fascinating talk. And we've got morning tea now. We've got half an hour. We'll be back here at 11 a.m. Network, chat, say hello. You'll be hanging around, won't you?
Yeah, we'll be.
Great.
I will be, yes. Thank you.